Hello everyone, Matt the Lesser here, back with another episode 7 in our Terra Mystica Fan Factions Basic Strategy series. For those who are new, we're going through the new fan factions that are currently in testing on BGA and soon to be released into the wild and actually produced, and you can go buy them for our favorite board game, Terra Mystica. We're going through these factions one by one and talking about basic strategy tips for how, when to play these factions. These videos are targeted at people who are familiar with the game of Terra Mystica. They've played games with the base factions, they know the rules, they know the mechanics, but maybe you haven't played these factions, or you've played one game with the factions and you're looking for tips to sort of up your game and get into this really new, exciting expansion for Terra Mystica, which offers so much realm for learning and exploration and creativity. I have really loved the games that I've been playing with all these fan factions, and it's been really fun to sort of figure out what the strategies are. So I want to share these tips with all of you. And today, episode 7 is probably the episode that I've been looking forward to most of the whole series. Maybe one other that'll come soon, but one of the factions that I absolutely am in love with. We've done one faction of every color except for one color, and so that 7th color, we'll be covering one of the factions today. That color is green, and the faction we are talking about is, of course, the Enlightened. When I first saw this faction announced by the designers, I was blown away at how weird it is, how different it is, and my first reaction was like, does this work? Is it balanced? It's so different. And so we're going to go into all of that today. This episode is probably going to be a little bit longer than some of the other ones because there's just so much nuance and so much difference to dive into. But the Enlightened are just such a cool faction. And for someone who's really into Terra Mystica, you will just love what's going on with these guys. I also love this artwork. You've got this kind of unassuming, impish little dude in the forest playing with, I can't tell if that's like a bug or a magic mushroom or something, but showing that he has reached some heightened state. And as we'll see, and even as it says in their description, the Enlightened are all about power. Power tokens, power bulls, power management is everything with the Enlightened. And so let's get into it. For those of you who don't know, I don't do video editing. I don't do animations. I don't have any fancy video techniques. So this will be the no frills, one kind of long take episode, basic strategy series, Enlightened. All right, let's go. So as always, let's start by looking at the board. And you look at this board and you're like, what is going on here? Okay, first, let's look at the production, which is maybe the place where things differ the most. What are these dwellings? So dwellings produce workers. That's how Terra Mystica works. No, not for the Enlightened. So for the Enlightened, every dwelling, instead of producing a worker, produces 2 power income. And they also have a base income of 2 power. TPs, a little closer to normal, produce coins and also some power, escalating coins as you go up. Temples, okay, still produce priests, that's good. Sanctuary produce priests. Stronghold, what is this whole thing? We're going to get into it in just a second. But also on the costs here, note that the Stronghold, the Sanctuary, and the Temple don't cost workers. So a little bit maybe of an alleviation since they don't produce any workers. There's no worker production on this whole board. Like, let's be clear about that. We're going to talk about how you solve that in a second, but there's no worker production. But these big buildings cost priests. 1 priest for a temple instead of 2 workers, 2 priests instead of 4 workers for sanctuary, and then this actually relatively cheap stronghold at only 1 priest and 4 coins. Jumping up to the top, okay, top left, actually a normal thing. They are a 5/7 faction, although wait a second, their base income is 2 power, and they're going to produce 4 more power in the beginning of round 1. So actually they start at 11/1 power, so that's different, even though it looks similar on the same. What are these spades? Also using power, right? Most factions here require workers to dig. These guys require 3 power for a basic dig. By the way, that's the same rate as your normal double dig action, so that's actually pretty good, and you can make it even cheaper. If you advance your digs with these guys, it costs you 1 power for a spade, which is pretty incredible. Normal starting resources, here's some actual workers for you to start with. You get your normal 3, but then you won't get 3 more from your original production. So you will start the game with just 3 workers plus any that you might get on bonus tiles. 15 coins and a couple air steps. We'll talk about those cult steps in a second. The Enlightened, in addition to being a power faction, are a very, very culty faction. And you'll see that down here in one of their 2 Vic abilities, this one on the right, which is that every time they pass a power threshold when they are going up the cults, they gain double the amount of power shown. So when they pass that first threshold between steps 2 and 3, they get 2 power instead of 1. When they step past that second one between 4 and 5, they get 4 power instead of 2, and up and up and up. This power on the cults is incredible for the Enlightened, especially since everything they are already doing is around power. So not only are you taking the resource they're already building their whole game around, but then you give them even more of it in conjunction with the cults, which are already good for getting cult rewards and points toward the end of the game. And it just focuses the Enlightened on being a very culty faction, and it's very, very good for them. The other power or book ability that they've got here is that anytime they can spend a coin to put an extra power token into Bull 1. The Enlightened have so much power sometimes that if they didn't have the ability to do this, they would constantly overflow their bulls and it would stall out their economy. If you play them well, you actually shouldn't have to use this ability very frequently, but to sort of make sure you don't lose any production, and as we'll get into in a second when we talk about the economy, it's almost always worth it to pay that coin, assuming you have it, to add this token if it allows you to reap the production back. And then finally, or I guess normal shipping, by the way, so there's something normal about this faction. And the digging, even though the digs cost power, the dig advances are the same cost, which actually makes these dig advances extremely expensive, even more so than normal, because workers, because they don't produce any, are very hard to come by. As the Enlightened, one of the biggest constraints on their economy is workers, and so having to spend 2 extra to advance your digging is quite a lot. But let's talk about the stronghold for a second, because the stronghold is an extremely important part of the Enlightened, and maybe the only thing that I don't love about the design of this faction is that the stronghold is almost an insta automatic have to build it in round 1. I have yet to see an Enlightened game where someone didn't build it in round 1 that doesn't work. Green factions, on many maps, including base map, which we'll talk about, can do very effective dwelling rushes. But these guys have weak dwellings, and by not building the stronghold, you lose out on this ability right here that is the whole foundation of how this faction generates resources that aren't power, right? All they're making is power. With all of their dwellings, with everything off the cults, power is going to be everything that they are focusing on. But these buildings still cost workers, right? You still need coins. So power is what's generating this, and this is the foundation of how their economy balances out. So we'll talk about it in detail in just a second. I have an extra slide in this presentation to talk about this, but let's start by just saying, what is it? It takes your normal conversion rates, which are normally 1 power in Bull 3 to 1 coin, 3 power in Bull 3 to 1 worker, 5 power in Bull 3 to a priest, and after you've built the stronghold, it doubles all of them. So 1 power becomes 2 coins, which is amazing. 3 power becomes 2 workers, which is also amazing, better than the worker's power action. And 5 power becomes 2 priests, also better than the priest power action. And these things are how you're going to generate all the resources that you need over the course of the game. Doing them at the single conversion rates will not work. It is just simply, you are not going to generate enough power over the course of the game to generate the resources that you need. The stronghold is what makes the economy of the Enlightened balanced and comparable to other factions, so that's why you need it so badly. Additionally, once you build the stronghold, it gives you this button that allows you to basically generate yourself 4 power. This is even better than if it just gave 4 power income, because number 1, you can use it in the round you build it, which is almost always going to be round 1. And also, it doesn't contribute to the danger of overflowing your initial power production. You can do your power production, spend some power in the course of the round, and then hit your button and regenerate power. So it actually sort of increases your capacity in that sense. So this is crazy. And what's actually really amazing is that it works. They are a strong faction, and some people in the right setups, they can be bordering on overpowered, but they're not terribly weak. They're not running away with every game. They are very high variance for reasons that we'll get into in a little bit, but like the fact that this kind of ends up translating properly to all the other factions, despite taking primarily their dwelling income and just completely using a different resource is actually kind of incredible. So applauds to Pascal Amberg, the designer, for making it work. And so let's talk a little bit more about what this all means and how to think about it. So this is the extra slide that I've got here on the Enlightened Economy. And again, it's this conversion rate that you have to orient your mind around. And one of the hardest things about playing the Enlightened for the first time, and even for the first few times, is just getting yourself used to thinking about these resources in a different way. So number one thing is that once you've built this, and all of this is once you've built the stronghold, right? But once you've built the stronghold, conversions are better than power actions. All of them. As we said, 5 power for 2 priests is better than 3 power for 1 priest. 3 power for 2 workers is better than 4 power for 2 workers. 4 power becomes 8 coins instead of 4 power becoming 7 coins. So you basically, as the Enlightened, should never take a power action. The only power actions you might ever want to take are the bridge, which is still the only way to get a bridge, and green, especially on base map, does often want bridges, so sometimes you'll do that. You may need to take a priest power action at the very beginning of the game to get a priest to build that stronghold to unlock these conversions. We'll talk about that in the opening a little bit, but having that priest in run 1, super important for the Enlightened. And then beyond that, the spades, you would never take 4 power for a single spade because your base conversion is 3 power for a single spade. You could theoretically take double dig because it's the same conversion rate, maybe if you want to block someone from double dig, so I guess you could see that happening. But for the most part, especially when it comes to the core resource generating power actions, you're better off just doing these conversions, which admittedly does help your opponents. Games with the Enlightened, sort of the whole floor for everybody comes up. Dwellings, on the other hand, are weaker, right? So we have, for anyone who's ever seen some like business consultant type presentations, I've included a nice green BFA here, which stands for a big effing arrow, which is a very fun thing. And so like dwellings produce only 2/3 of a worker, right? So let's think about how the production translates into the resources, right? So a dwelling produces 2 power production. That's equivalent to 1 power in bowl 3 that could be used for conversions, and 3 power produces 2 workers. So the math there is that 1 dwelling production doesn't produce what the equivalent of a full worker. It produces only the equivalent of 2/3 of a worker. Therefore, dwellings for the Enlightened are actually weaker than they are for other factions. So we've talked about with other factions, and if you've played a lot of Terra Mystica, you know how important dwellings are to your economy. You do not want to stall out your worker production. Getting dwellings out is one of the most surefire ways to have a strong economy. It's a little bit less true for the Enlightened. On the other hand, 1 power production for the Enlightened is equal to 1 coin. This is doubly as good as power production for any other faction. So for example, your dwellings produce 2 coins, or that 1 power, or your TPs effectively produce the number of coins they produce, plus 1 more coin. Of course, you can the flexibility of the power is also the key to the Enlightened, right? Like you can interchange all of these things, but these are sort of the equivalents. 3 power is 2 workers. 3 power is also a spade for the Enlightened. So that means that a spade is effectively 2 workers, but also your workers are more expensive. So in some ways, those actually kind of cancel out. But having that 3 power spade access is it's very good for the flexibility of the Enlightened. In fact, they can get the spades whenever. But in terms of what they're spending on them, it is still pretty expensive. So spades and workers, as we've say over here, are the biggest constraints for the Enlightened. So when you're thinking about, okay, what do I need to seek out additional things on, for example, bonus tiles, cult rewards. Really good to look for spades and workers. And then finally the cults. So we mentioned this, but this double power production for going up these levels of the cults are just so incredibly strong for the Enlightened. For example, if you go from, you start all below the lowest threshold for all the cults. If you get to the top of any cult, all the way to the 10 spot, that you will have generated 16 power. That alone is like a full round, at least, especially in early rounds, worth of production for these guys. Just on the increases, not to mention any cult rewards that you may have triggered along the way. 16 power, for example, is 16 power generated is 16 coins generated, or is, as we said, 2/3 of a worker. So that would be like 10 workers roughly. I mean, that's incredible. So go up those cults, get those rewards, and you did get the points in the cult rewards along the way too. But getting that power is so strong. And finally, this is probably obvious and it's true for every faction, but like, holy crap, Leech is so good for the Enlightened. It just continues to propel their economy. One thing we'll talk about in a second, though, is like the Enlightened, they effectively start with actually a lot of stuff early on. Just even their starting power and their starting resources are really good for them. They need to have explosive starts to contend in games. You should be trying to get a lot down in round 1 or round 2, because these 2 power dwellings are just such relatively weaker things that they don't pay out once you've built them. The return on the investment isn't as strong, and so your production relative to other factions is not going to scale as well over the course of the game. So you really need to get out the gate early in order to sort of keep pace with everybody else. So that's the economy. Like, you have to wrap your head around all these different resource values, and it's a really just important think about playing this faction. Like, you have to be able to think about, okay, what do I need this round? What does that mean in terms of how much power do I have? If I'm going to send some priests to the cults, how much extra power am I going to produce? Don't forget about your stronghold button, because it's so much power cycling compared to any other faction. So let's try to keep all of that in mind and talk about when we want to play the Enlightened. So starting with the bonus tiles, and you'll see there's a theme here that I highlighted in the last slide, which is that their biggest deficit, workers and spades. So when we're talking about what bonus tiles do we want to have in the game, we want workers and spades. Big building tile, worker power, spade bonus tile. We also have the priest bonus tile, primarily because, as we talked about, you need to have a priest in round 1 as the Enlightened, and you don't naturally start with one, but you need one to build that stronghold. So one of the most obvious ways to get a priest in round 1 is off of the bonus tile. Now, experienced players playing against the Enlightened will try to deny them this priest bonus tile, but the easiest way for them to deny them, obviously, is just to not have it in the game at all. So that's also a very good thing to have in the game for the Enlightened. On the other side, Enlightened want to send priests to cults. They don't want to, and the priests are expensive, right? 5 power, even though it's cheaper than a normal power action, is still quite a bit to spend to get a priest. They can also produce them off of temples. It's the only thing they produce, besides power. I guess they produce coins, but they do produce temples like normal faction. But generally, they don't have a bunch of extra priests lying around. And so they're probably not going to advance their shipping as much. And this is actually a departure from most other green factions, which like to advance their shipping and spread around. The Enlightened having expensive but at least easy access to spades, and often spades on cults, like to dig for their expansion a little more than normal. So anyways, ship scoring, not so great. The other one, obviously, dwelling scoring, not so great for the Enlightened. Not that they can't score this. They certainly can, especially late in the game. They will eventually want to spread out. But the dwellings aren't as good. And so, it makes more sense for them to not have a tile that rewards a bunch of dwellings in the game. As far as the other factions, color wheel's true here. It's always true. On base map particularly, brown, I think, is the best neighbor for green. And this is especially true for the Enlightened, because you want a neighbor that's going to give you leech early on. In addition to being a good color neighbor on the wheel, you want someone who's going to be placing next to you, and both of brown's most common starting spots are next to common green starting spots, and so there's lots of leech to be there. Gray-green base map is bad, everyone knows that, so obviously that continues to be true here. But also the other bad one for the Enlightened, and honestly in some cases might actually even be worse than gray, is having really culty factions, because the Enlightened really want to get high on lots of cults. They really want the 2-key town. They want to send a lot of priesthood cults early. If there are other factions who want to do that, that's going to, just by pushing them off of 3 spots, having competition for the towns, limit the heights that the Enlightened can get to on those cult tracks, and that's going to not only limit their scoring, but also limit the power that they're getting from all of the increases of crossing over those thresholds. So, I know I said brown, but Enlightened really do not want to see cultists. They really do not want to see chaos magicians, swarmlings, right? These are the types of factions that, Enlightened don't want to see. They love halflings, nomads, prospectors, factions that do not play very culty. And then finally, on the scoring tiles, I have a lot of stuff shown here, and obviously not all of this needs to be true for it to be a good setup for the Enlightened, but let's come back to workers and spades are good. So in the early, we have the big building scoring tiles give workers. That's great. It's also good because you, especially in round 1, you want to build you want to build your stronghold anyways. Big building tiles also good in round 2 or round 3 because the Enlightened often want to form a fast town to take the 2-key town. And so one of the easiest ways to do that is to build a sanctuary stronghold dwelling town. It only costs 2 spades usually. And so having another sort of similar to the swarmlings here of the up first and then out, if at all, strategy, around 2 or around 3 big building tile, also very good for the Enlightened to hit a sanctuary and or just more worker rewards. Big infusions of workers into the game are amazing for the Enlightened because then they don't have to spend tons and tons of power generating workers, which is the only other way that they can really generate workers. I guess there's the bonus tiles too. And then similarly, TP rewards, really good. Because the TPs give spades. Not that you actually want to spam out a ton of TPs early on as Enlightened, although you do often build one. You definitely build one and at least 2 in round, at least 1 and often 2 TPs in round 1, which we'll get to in a second. But these spades are just, it's like each spade is like 2 workers, right? Think about the transition that we talked about, the economy there. So these rewards are actually pretty equivalent for the Enlightened if you're hitting the same thresholds. So the spade rewards are very good as well. I also have the town key one in here. This can also be good in round 2, round 3. Enlightened can often get a town on that timeline, and this reward also gives more spades. Great for the Enlightened. It's when we get into the later parts of the game, you really want to see dwelling scorings toward the end, because that's when you want to spam out all your dwellings. Enlightened can also surprisingly hit a round 4 digging round pretty well, and if they can get their economy rolling early enough to have enough resources in round 4 to advance their spades, then their digs become incredibly cheap. 1 power for a dig is equivalent to 2 coins for a dig is just absolutely incredible. This is also the one point in the game, through the temple scoring here too, where a nice infusion of coins can be well timed. I mean, this is true for a lot of factions, not just the Enlightened, but for a faction particularly that is going to throw a bunch of priests to cults early in the game to try to hit those cult advances, having this temple reward can be quite nice. And I have a TP scoring down here in round 5 too, just because sort of normal high scoring tracks are good for the Enlightened. They don't have any inherent scoring, so they do need to find a lot of points, and obviously having a nice track like round 5 TPs into round 6 dwellings is really nice for the Enlightened. On the other hand, not nearly as much to highlight here on the bad side, but I do find that temple and spade scorings in the early first couple rounds are a lot less good for the Enlightened, particularly because the cult rewards on those tiles are coins, which are the, unlike many factions, the least constrained resource for the Enlightened is coins. because all that power can be generated and turned into a lot of coins pretty easily. And so just not getting spades or workers that you crucially need early on, it's just a much bigger loss. It just slows down that snowball of your economy a lot more. The temple scoring is also doubly bad because it encourages other factions to build lots of temples, maybe even factions to be put in the game that want to open temple as opposed to big building. And that's going to cause more priests to be in the game, more priests going to cults, fighting you for cult dominance. It's like an extra benefit of that big building scoring tile is that it often draws more stronghold open factions into the game, which reduces the number of priests. Really good for the Enlightened. Enlightened having like no competition for the cults is that's how they run away with games. They can just be so strong. I didn't put it here too, but dwelling scorings early obviously also aren't as good. We already talked about how dwelling rush doesn't really work. You can spam a bunch of dwellings in round 2 after you've built your stronghold in round 1, and it's not bad. It just doesn't have quite the punch of most other factions because your dwellings are just relatively weaker. And then the other thing that's bad is having big building scoring in round 6. The main reason it's bad in round 6 is because it means it's not somewhere else in the game and you can't take advantage of all those juicy workers from the cult reward. But also because, as we talked about, Enlightened do need some scoring, and the big building scoring in round 6 is just not around there. It doesn't generate a lot of points. They're probably not going to hit it because they probably want to build both their stronghold and their sanctuary earlier in the game. I mean, they can wait on the sanctuary, but you just would really rather see TP or dwelling scoring that you can take much better advantage of there in round 6. So a lot to think about, but you can kind of think, if you just sort of envision the process of an Enlightened game, right? Get the stronghold, gather your resources, build up, and then kind of try to get all your scoring at the end. That will sort of inform naturally where what a good setup for them looks like. Okay, so now we know when to play them. Let's talk about the map. Pretty standard green stuff here for the Enlightened. I have F4 starred. We've talked a lot about the center section of this map, how on base map, this center peninsula is where all the action always happens, and Leech, as we covered, super important for the Enlightened. So you're almost always going to want to start on F4 because you're very likely to have neighbors if you have any of these colors, yellow, brown, or gray in the game. And if not, you're going to get red digging here, or you're going to come up next to blue. Like basically no matter what colors are in the game, you can start on F4. You're going to get some leech either from people upgrading next to you or coming next to you, or both. And all of that is good. After F4, I think the other spot is a little more dependent on where other people are placing and who your neighbors are. But really my thought would be seek out the leech as much as possible. So if you've got red in the game, then C3 or E9 is probably great because they're going to do D4, D7. C4 is a nice spot sometimes to block blue, or if black is in the game and starts on B5, you can get some nice leech up there. But I think really just securing leech is probably the most important thing. And any of these other spots are really going to be fine for the Enlightened. The one thing to note is that if you don't start on E9, depending on what your competition looks like in the middle, your immediate dig access is a little limited on this map. And as we said, you'd really prefer not to invest in shipping early. So either there needs to be temp ship that you can grab on to get off to a little bit if you're not going to start on E9, or you just need to be prepared to, double dig B5, or maybe have to dig G2 or spend an early bridge or something like that. All of these things, again, are not problematic. It's just about being really efficient with that early resources, because the snowball effect for the Enlightened is heightened, maybe even compared to some of the other factions. Okay, so there's the map. Let's talk about the openings. So we've mentioned it a couple times, but the stronghold, because it unlocks that conversion ability that is the whole backbone of the Enlightened Economy, you really, really do want to build it in round 1. I would say, especially if you're playing these guys for the first handful of times, don't try to do around with something fancy. Once you feel like you've got a hold of them and you've got some game where it's like dwelling scoring in round 1, stronghold scoring in round 2, and you want to try, by all means, going for it. But if you're playing for these guys for the first time, I would just say build a stronghold in round 1 and don't mess around. Here's the thing. To build a stronghold in round 1, you need a priest. And you do not start with the priest. So you have to either have the priest tile, take the priest power action, or, way less good than either of those two options, do a 5 power priest single conversion. And it would be single because you haven't actually built the stronghold yet. So a lot of this is going to depend on the seat order, right? Like if you are in seat 1, you have guaranteed access to the priest power action. So if you're in seat 1, don't ever feel afraid of, and you're doing pick factions, don't ever feel afraid to grab the Enlighten. Conversely, if the priest power tile or bonus tile is in the game and you're in seat 4, don't be afraid to take them either. It's when you're in a late seat with no priest tile in the game, or, well, that's actually really, if you're in a late seat with no priest action in the game, or you're kind of in the middle and the tile is there, but you think the people in the seats after you might take it, that's when it gets a little bit dicey. And so if you aren't quite sure that you're going to be able to get a priest via one of these two avenues early in the game, it would really make me hesitant to pick the Enlighten. But let's assume that you get your priest, you are able to build your TP and then build your stronghold. You have spent 2 workers and 7 coins, since that stronghold only costs a priest and 4 coins and TPs are normal. And now you're left with 1 worker and 8 coins and a whole bunch of power that you haven't even spent yet. Maybe you spent a little bit on the priest, but a lot of it that you haven't spent yet. You've also unlocked your stronghold button, so you're going to get 4 more power plus any more leech. And so now the world is your oyster. Have fun in round 1 with the Enlightened. There's a lot of things you can do. Here is how my suggestion would be to go about it. I would say do at least 1 5 power to 2 priests conversion. It gets you started with your cult economy. It gets you able to get some of that power back immediately by starting to cross some of those thresholds. And you can then potentially, if you want to, use one of those priests to build a temple. But first of all, sending a priest to air is just like always a good decision. The fact that you start with 2 steps on air is one of the, if the data proves that the Enlightened are too strong, the number one thing that I would suggest doing is removing that 2nd step on air. Because right now you have the ability to send a priest to air and immediately get 6 power production back, because you cross both the 1 power threshold between 2 and 3, and then also the 2 power threshold between 4 and 5. That gets doubled and you get 6 power back. So that's amazing. And then you have another priest that you could send to air as well. You often will have enough power, by the way, to be able to do 2 of these conversions, especially after you've generated some back with the air and another 2 off, water or whatever other cult you want to send, or maybe another to air if round 1 is an air reward. We didn't talk about that, by the way, really quickly. Let's go back here. I don't want to forget this. Between when we have the, we've talked about the big building and the TP rewards in round 1. Air is like doubly good for either of these because they start on air and can take that much better advantage of these. So that's maybe obvious, but definitely want to call that out. The fire big building and the water TP are also totally playable, still very good for the Enlightened, but not quite as good as the air. Ideally, in a good Enlightened game, you got air rewards, both of them somewhere in the game. Okay, sorry. Going back to this now. So you can get that 6 power back right away by going up on air. Maybe you go up on another one and just get that going. Obviously, follow those early cult rewards. So if early is air, that's great. If round 1 is big building fire rewards, send 1 to fire. Especially if you've taken the priest bonus tile and you don't have darklings or something like that in the game, then you might not have immediate competition for those cult rewards. So you should be able to get them. If you can get 2 or 3 spots in the first round of the game, you're just setting yourself up really, really well. I've seen people send as many as 5 priests to air in the first round as the Enlightened. I think personally 5 is a little high. I think 3 might be the sweet spot. You do 2 of these conversions, which gives you 4 priests. 3 of them go to 3 different 3 spots, or maybe a 3 spot, a 2 spot, and another 3 spot. and then you have one left to build a TP. To build a temple. So the other thing that I've seen be quite successful for the Enlightened in round one is that after you've built your stronghold and you have access to these conversions, you often will have enough resources to do some of these priests and then build a temple, which is good because one, it will start producing more priests, so you don't have to always convert 5, but also because you can get a favor tile, which is always good, just like for any other faction. Now you start with 3 workers as the Enlightened. You had to spend 2 of them on the first TP to build your stronghold. So obviously to build a temple, you're going to need 2 more, and you only have 1. So the most natural way to get those is to do a 3 power to 2 worker conversion, often your first one of the game. Welcome to the Enlightened. You might also have taken the big building scoring tile, which is another very good way to get it. But either way, you're going to have that 1 extra worker, which can often be used to build a dwelling in addition to the temple. So one little trick tip here that I like is, if you can, build the dwelling first next to the stronghold on a hex that's neighboring your starting hex. That's a single dig, and build your temple there. And the reason to do this is because then eventually that temple can become, and not eventually, like quickly, that temple can become a sanctuary, and those initial hexes with just 1 more dig often can become a town, and that early town can be a 2-key town, which goes you up more on cults, gives you more power back from crossing those thresholds in addition to cult rewards, and again, you're just continuing the snowball. If you don't, you can always often build, or of course you can build your temple on the other dwelling, your other starting dwelling. Maybe if you really want, like, I don't think Earth 1 is the right call, but in some games, if you really get a ton of leech, like maybe you just go straight for Earth 1, you want to get that before you build a dwelling, or whatever, that works too. The temple opening makes the most sense, by the way, in my mind. Obviously the big building, if you have a big building scoring tile, you can kind of do whatever you want. I think the temple makes extra sense if you have either the TP scoring rounds, obviously if it's the temple scoring round, which in general we've said is not as good, but still if you're there, or even the town scoring round, just because of this spade bonus. And the reason all of these are true, I highlight these spade bonuses particularly, is because the temple will help you get to the 4 spot on any of these, particularly the water and the earth one, by taking water 2. One of my favorite tiles for the Enlightened in round 1 is water 2. And that's because these cult steps are just so valuable for the Enlightened that getting an extra 8 of them, which is what water 2 is, over the course of the game can be worth as much production or close to as much production as, like, air 2, for example, by those extra cult steps. If you sort of think about the way that the cult board is laid out, 8 extra steps is kind of like crossing each 1 threshold extra on each of the 4 tracks, which is like generating 16 power total. That's not that much less than if you took air 2, which produces 20 power, and of course the water 2 steps come with cult rewards and points at the end of the game, in addition to that extra power production. So Earth 2 and Air 2 and Fire 1 even can also work really well for the Enlightened, but I particularly love Water 2. And if you've gotten, say you're in either the town scoring or TP scoring with the water reward, if you've gotten that first priest to that cult, you're going to be at the 3 step. Water 2 instantly puts you over. Of course, the other, either Earth 2, well, I guess it would be Earth 2 if it's the Earth 1, right, would also get you over. But Water 2, I really do enjoy it with the Enlightened. The other option, by the way, if you don't want to build a temple, and this is probably most relevant if it's dwelling scoring, or maybe if there's like temple scoring in round 2, is to just build a bunch of dwellings. This is made easier if you have the spade tile, or say there was temp ship. Maybe you're in first seat and the only good tile that gets back to you is temp ship, and you want to take advantage of claiming some territory while you have access to it. Okay, go ahead, build some dwellings. again, I would recommend this after you build your stronghold. You're probably going to need to do some worker conversions at the very least, and you can easily get out at least 3 workers, right? Or 3 dwellings, because you have that one leftover worker from after your initial stronghold build, and maybe you do 1 more conversion. And even with a couple spades, you could actually get out 5 workers too. Is a totally doable worker with the Enlightened, and all of that's still, again, in addition to sending a priest or 2 to the cults. So the Enlightened just have an absolute ton of options. So I would say get as much out as you can, get some priests to the cults, and just get yourself set up. Whatever that round 1 cult reward is, definitely hit that. Ideally, you're setting yourself up for the round 2 cult reward already too, and also for an early town. So after you've had your gangbusters opening, right? How do you keep it going, right? How do we keep going through the game as the Enlightened and put ourselves in a position to win? So we've already talked about cult power and rewards, but it's worth emphasizing throughout the whole game. Think about, what are those next thresholds that I can hit if I send a priest here? What do I get back? Especially once you start producing priests on temples, throwing them to cults just gives you more power back that you can feed into your engine. We mentioned the 2 key town. It's so good, right? If you get 2 or 3, if you already have 2 or 3 priests down, and so you're at anywhere basically from step 3 or above on the cults, you get that 2 key town, and it's like, bam, you get 12, 16 power back instantly from that. That's like way better than a power town, and you have all these cult productions. It's just so good. Not to mention that crossing onto the 10 spot of any cult with the Enlightened gives you immediately 6 power back. That's like 2 workers or 6 coins. That's, again, really good. To be able to cross those 10s, you need keys. So that much better reason for the 2 key town. As you go forward and you start producing more and more with the Enlightened, 2 things you do have to keep an eye on are your priest production and your power production. Priests, because you send a lot of priests to the cults early in the game, it's actually quite easy to get yourself into a sticky situation where you can't produce all the priests that you normally want to produce, or even sometimes, sort of without realizing it, you've sent 6 priests to the cults, and then you can't do your 5 power to 2 priests conversion. So I would be very careful, especially until the very late stages of the game, of going above 5 priests put to the cults. That plus like a water 2 or another 2-step favor tile, and maybe the 2 key town. That's going to get you plenty elevated and taking advantage of all that power coming in off the tracks. Power production, going back to when we were talking about the board, they obviously just produce a ton of power because of all those, especially once you start getting a bunch of dwellings out. So be careful you're not going to overflow there. Use that little ability to spend a coin to increase your production if you need to. The other thing with the Enlightened is, like, you can get into this tricky spot where you have a bunch of power sitting in bowl 2. You've done a bunch of conversions, maybe you take some leech. Ideally, you're like only converting a little bit into bowl 1 and then trying to funnel it back to bowl 3 as quickly as possible, so you don't get into the situation where it's like the end of the round, you've got 10 leech and it's all sitting in bowl 2 and you're supposed to produce 16 power or something like that. That's where you can get a little bit out of whack. So just be really careful with how that power gets produced. Use that button on the stronghold strategically to get yourself out of those sticky situations, and you'll be in good shape. We talked about spades. If you spend 3 power for all this, if you want to do a wide game and you try to spend 3 power on all the spades you need for over the course of the game, you're going to destroy your economy. So you really need either spades off the cult rewards, maybe the bonus tile spade, or if those things aren't existing in the game, that's when I would push you toward upgrading digging, right? So like maybe the first 2 rewards are worker rewards, and so you're able to get out a bunch of dwellings and you're actually producing a lot of power. For the next sort of set of spades to roll out and complete your towns and stuff, like think about upgrading digging, because if you can afford the resources, which is a lot, that priest plus 2 workers plus 5 coins times 2 really to do it ideally, is a hell of a lot of an investment. But once you do it, the spades are super cheap, and you will make up for the fact, by not spending 3 power on every spade. I would say the optimal way to do it is just get them all off the colts. But if they're not there, then you got to find other solutions. And then finally, when you're thinking about the economy, go back to the economy slide. Think about what things are worth. When you pass, what you build extra is just a little bit different, right? Building that extra dwelling is a little bit less valuable. Upgrading a dwelling into a TP, similar to a normal game, is not actually that valuable. If you have the chance to pass, like one of the reasons the big building tile is really important to have in the game for the Enlightened is not so much the scoring, even though obviously you like that, it's that there's 2 workers sitting on that thing. Like if you have the ability to pass for that thing, it's like producing 6 power. It's like having 3 extra dwellings out, right? So like you'd rather don't build the dwelling and just take that tile when it's available to you, especially if you don't take it, you're going to get left with like, the dwelling scoring of 2 coins or something like that. So just think about, those trade-offs. When we think about the Enlightened, overall, where are the points coming from? Obviously, we need to hit the track hard. I didn't put this in one of these, but like you are probably need a scoring favor. So when you build that sanctuary, maybe for a town in round 3, for example, or if you build another temple in round 3 or round 4, like that's when you need to grab Earth 1. If it's still there, is great. Water 1 works too. But you're gonna need to generate some points there, and then obviously the cults, right? Like a good Enlightened game, 28 points on the cults is totally doable. 24 points, totally doable. So they're very high scoring cult factions, as you might imagine, and they also can be pretty competitive on network, just because they do. If you do the economy right, will have enough resources to sort of build out by the end of the game. They're maybe not quite as gonna go as wide as engineers or goats or nomads or someone like alchemists, right? But they can, compete with most factions on networks. That's kind of why I've got medium plus. As far as the overall power goes, these guys are high. This is a good faction. Very tricky to play properly. You play your first live game. I've seen people score in the 80s with these guys, and I've seen people score, almost 200 with these guys. Depending on how much people mess with you. But like if things break right and it's a good setup for them, they're one of the best factions in Terra Mystica, or at least they have the ability to be. So definitely don't think that they are weak with this wonky board and this crazy economy. So I hope all of that was helpful. Much longer episode than normal. There's a lot to cover, and who knows, we might have to do like a part 2 once we've learned more or something. I just find them so interesting. So much fun to play. But when you start sending priest to cults and they're going up and you're generating tons of power and you're just cycling it and it's all working together, it's just a really cool feeling. And for people who sort of like exploring and being creative, right, there's so much more latitude with these guys, because they're basically, instead of trying to balance all these different resources, they're generating one resource in spades, no pun intended, and then figure out what to do with it. And like it's just a very different experience. So please have fun with the Enlightened. Do not be scared of them. And then find me on BGA. Tell me how your games are going. Let me know in the comments. And go find some enlightenment. Have a great time, and we'll be back soon with another episode. We'll have to go back to a color that we've already visited. But this is officially the halfway mark of the season, so I hope everyone is really enjoying these videos. And until next time, we'll see you later. All right, bye.